Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you see my screen, full screen? Okay. So yeah, again, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to speak to your consortium, and hope I can give you a bit of insight into well, open source in general and how we do open source at the Eclipse Foundation, and hopefully you can gain some insights maybe that could be useful for your work in the NFDI. So let's jump right into it. Software is eating the world, or software ate the world. This bold statement is not from me. It was coined by Marc Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, more than 10 years ago in his famous article called Software is Eating the World, where he predicted that over the next 10 years, well, almost all industries will be disrupted by software, and almost all innovations will be done by software. And well, I guess there's not much debate about this answer if he was right. Just if we look at, well, already in 2009, even in industries like the aviation industry or automotive industry, there was so much code already in running these systems that, well, his prediction was pretty accurate at that time already. And even now, I mean, in 2014, 10 years ago as well, 90% of automotive innovations were from electronics and software. And these days, we're even speaking about things like software-defined vehicles. So the amount of code and the relevance of software for innovation is constantly increasing. And well, I guess you will not disagree to me if we can say, okay, software ate the world. But now, what about open source? Is open source eating software? And to look into this, I like to tell this little story about Microsoft. And the older ones among you may remember Steve Ballmer, infamous CEO of Microsoft at that time, who in 2001 said Linux is a cancer, and open source and GPL, that's hippie rubbish stuff that contaminates all other software. So not very, let's say, open-minded towards the idea of open source. But then this changed, and in 2015, Microsoft, under his new CEO Nadella, was more like, we love open source. So something had changed in their mind. And in 2016, and that's quite astonishing, I think Microsoft was the #1 organization on the number of contributors to GitHub, which is, well, would not be very obvious at first glance. And well, you can see on this list, most of the big players are on top rank of this list. Unfortunately, not so many European companies, but that's another story. And then in 2018, they even got further, and Microsoft acquired GitHub. So the #1 open source, open collaboration platform for sharing code and for doing open source development. So over these, well, almost 20 years, some mind change has happening in Microsoft. And yeah, I think this little story helps to grasp the idea that open source is eating software and is eating the world, if you wish. And this is also backed by numbers, right? 81% of companies are using open source in their products these days. If you're a software developer, if you're a software company, you're dealing with open source in one or the other way. That's just standard these days. And 80 to 90% of an application is open source. So you rely on frameworks developed by others, which are released under an open source license. And yeah, basically the whole economy as we know it is based on open technologies, right? So these two friendly guys here, Tim Berners-Lee and Vint Cerf, who invented the World Wide Web and the TCP/IP protocol. Without these open technologies, probably the internet would not look like the way it is today. So, oh yes, open technologies can be big game changers because they allow, if done properly, all these nice kind of features like standardization by adoption. They enable free flow of knowledge, innovation through integration by not having to reinvent the wheel, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of these also promises by open source. But the question then is how to implement those and how to be successful when doing open source. And to dive a bit into this, let's start a bit from the basics on the foundation and the fundamental principles of open source, because that's important to always keep in mind when talking about open source, because nowadays, as open source is becoming more and more mainstream and topic of many discussions, sometimes these things start to blur a bit. So there's only one definition of free software and then later open source software, which was originally developed by Richard Stallman, the guy on the top right. Some of you may know him, and he came up with these 4 fundamental freedoms of free software, which quite nerdy enough, start counting by 0. So the first freedom is under free software, you have the freedom to run the program for any purpose. Freedom number 1, you have the freedom to study how the program works and change it to make it do what you wish. Freedom number 2, you have the freedom to redistribute copies of the software. And freedom number 3, you even have the freedom to redistribute copies of the modified version to others. So that's open source, right? That's the definition of free software and open source software. And then there are some best practices or also fundamental basics, which are more related to the process or best practice when doing open source, and that's transparency, openness, and meritocracy. So in open source, when you develop software, you have to do it in a transparent way. So everything's open and for everybody to see. And that does not go only for the code, but also for documentation, things like meeting minutes and the process, how you develop software in collaboration with others. Then there's second, openness. So everybody is welcome to contribute to your open source project. You cannot exclude somebody because you don't like them, or I don't know, they come from another company, they are your worst enemy. So that's not possible. If you do open source and you're doing true open source, you have to allow everybody to contribute to your open source software. And the third fundamental thing is meritocracy, which means you earn your merits in open source. So if you do substantial contributions to an open source project, you kind of climb up the ladder in responsibility that you get in an open source project. So you cannot, like for example, you cannot appoint a colleague to an open source project to be a committer in open source just because he's a colleague. He should have before done some substantial contributions to the code. And in that way, you can avoid, for example, like taking one company control over one open source project, which should be driven by a community and not by a single company. And these 3, but this is what we call the open source best practices or fundamental principles that for us as a foundation are key and things we try to implement for our community. Okay. Well, talk a lot about open source, of course, and there are different flavors of open source. Not all open source is the same. There's some distinction to do, which can be useful. So generally, open source means open collaboration, right? then there is this, let's say the most basic approach. Say you, for example, as a researcher, you develop some very cool tool or application or program, and you want to share it with the world. So you upload it to GitHub, because GitHub is a great tool for sharing code and for collaborating with others. So GitHub has a thriving developer community. And of course, you find lots of projects, high quality code that solve complex or not so complex projects. But what's the issue with pushing your code on GitHub? GitHub is a great tool, as I said. But the thing is, besides your project, there are more than 430 million of repositories currently being hosted on GitHub. So you may have difficulties to, like that little guy, try to gain some attention and to build a community and to find adopters for your software among all these other projects that are on GitHub. And there's an interesting study which took a look at this from a more scientific perspective. And they found out that a significant number of GitHub projects die in the first year of existence. And the probability of surviving longer than 5 years is less than 50%. So there must be more to doing successful open source than just pushing some code to GitHub. And that's also something we see quite often in research projects, that in the end of the project, the consortium pushes code on GitHub, makes a check mark on open source, and that's it. And then, well, after 3 years, everybody goes their way. The project ends. There is some code on GitHub, but nobody cares about it anymore. In the worst case, and that's something we want to try to avoid, and we want to help people doing better. There's another issue if you rely on any other project hosted on GitHub. So there's this example, a project called NodeIPC by a guy called Brandon Miller, which is a Node.js module for inter-process communication. Pretty famous one, I would say. So it has 1 million weekly downloads. It's maintained for over 8 years. So pretty decent project, right? Well known, well maintained, all fine. But then what happened? In 2022, on March, the guy, Brandon Miller, added code that would wipe out your disk if you would call the project from an IP coming from Russia or Belarus. So, and that's an issue because, I mean, there's 1 million weekly downloads. People rely on this, and that's the issue that you have with code and open source code being under the control and maintained mainly by just one single person. So this is stuff that can happen if you rely on any other project on GitHub. So there is some danger, but yeah, to it. And then we have the second flavor, or the next flavor of open source, which is called single vendor open source. And in that case, the open source project is owned, maintained by a single company. And in contrast to the first, more private example, let's say, of course, a company has the power and money to do some proper marketing and ecosystem community building things like that around a project. But again, we have the same issue with this. If the project is under control by a single company, that company can do what they want with the open source code. And there are some also pretty recent examples where companies have changed the license model of their product. So one very prominent example is MongoDB or Elasticsearch, who I think both were under Apache license. I'm not 100% sure, but we're doing open source. We're putting their software under open source license. But then at some point, the big cloud players like Amazon and so on were offering this software as a service in their cloud services. And so they were making a lot of money with the open source tools developed by these companies. And these companies like Elastic and MongoDB were not very happy with this. And well, at some point decided to invent a new license, which was called the server-side public license, which in fact is not an open source license anymore. So they drastically changed the licensing model from being an open source license to a not open source license anymore, which is a problem for you know, the whole community relying on these things. And maybe a lot of people invested also time and effort into contributing to these tools. So, and then, you know, Google, of course, that's more for political reasons, right? What can happen? Cutting off Huawei from Android open source. So this is problems that can happen if open source projects are controlled by a single company. And then what the third flavor is called community-driven open source. And that's what open source foundations usually do. And there's not only the Eclipse Foundation, there's of course the Linux Foundation and Mozilla Foundation and lots of other open source foundations. And what they do is enabling vendor-neutral open collaboration. So really trying to ensure these principles that I mentioned before to allow companies and organizations to work together and collaborate together on open source software, and not having just one single entity in control and being able to do whatever they want and change licenses, for example, and things like that. So that's called community-driven open source. And as you can imagine, things get much more complex if we talk about community-driven open source, because as opposed to single vendor open source, where just one company can decide on everything, right? On the process, on who's a committer, who's the development team, what will be accepted in the code base, and so on. On community-driven open source, this has to be well negotiated or governed across all these entities who are collaborating on an open source project. So we are moving also from closed processes to open processes. And this, in fact, needs proper governance. So governance is a term you will hear quite often if you do open source and get to this stage where you want to do, you know, professional open source, want to move from having a project on GitHub to really collaborating with others, with other companies or universities or whatsoever. And governance, what does it mean? Governance are the rules and customs that define who gets to do what and how they are supposed to do it in this complex multi-entity environment. And just to give you a little idea of what that means in more concrete terms, so governance basically means implementing these principles that I mentioned before: openness, transparency, meritocracy, and vendor neutrality. So having a level playing field for all the organizations collaborating on a project. And then we have to think about things like we have users who want to have some degree of trust, like, you know, when thinking about the story of the project by Miller. We have to think about committers. So who can be a committer to the project? Who is allowed to accept pull requests, to push code into the project? What are their privileges and responsibilities? Who can contribute? How to contribute? You know, how to implement this idea of meritocracy? How do releases look like? So we want, you know, that also relates to trust. You know, we want to have a release scheme or some requirements for releases, so an adopter or user can have some degree of trust that a released version of the software is something that fulfills certain requirements. And then we need to think about licenses and IP management. So if we develop a software, an open source software, yeah, we rely on a lot of open source, on other people's open source software, and which is under a certain license. So think about I mean, how many dependencies you have in your project. So in your project, you need to be compliant to these licenses. So that's a topic we will look into in a minute. So all these things is what governance in community-driven open source project means, and that's what open source foundations basically do and provide. So coming back to this comparison table, what open source foundations add is exactly this predictable processes and guidance, the vendor neutral governance, and business-friendly IP and licensing. And I'm sorry for this, but we have to talk a little bit about licenses. I know it's a delicate topic, and there's a lot of gray in that area, and often the software developers, I know it from myself, don't like to talk or think about licenses, but in fact, it's not that difficult and not that complex. And there are a few things that are important to keep in mind. And this is what I want to talk about a little bit now. So I have this little quiz. And the question is, if you publish code, let's say on GitHub, so you have a nice project, you want to publish it, share it with the world, and you don't add any copyright or license information to it, then which rights do apply to this code? So first option, is it just copyright, so all rights reserved? Is it B, Apache 2.0 as default license, or is it C, nothing at all? You know, everybody can do what they want with the code. So if you have an idea, feel free to put it in the chat. And let's have a look. I see already 3 times A, C. Okay, so A is in the front, and yes, you're right. If you do nothing, copyright applies, just with any other piece of art, right? I mean, that's what software is in the end. So it's just normal intellectual property law applies to software. So it's worth thinking about licenses, because, you know, if we want to share our code, that's not what we want to have, right? We don't want to have it copyrighted. We want to share it with the world and add the proper license to it. And yeah, I think we had that already, right? Your software program, 80 to 90% of an application is made up of open source. I like to visualize with this image. You have your application code and a lot of third-party code and libraries you rely on in your project. And there's a lot of open source licenses out there. But luckily, there is an organization, the Open Source Initiative, which is kind of the steward for open source licenses. So what they do is they approve or not a license to be an OZ-approved open source license. So if you, at some point, are in doubt, you see a license, you don't know it, one good idea is to have a look on the OZ website. If a license is OZ approved, then that's already a good sign. Still, we will come to a lot of differences on different license types, but if a software is run claiming to be open source and running under a license which is not approved by OZ, that's problematic. Yeah, so that's for me the most important slide on the licenses, the license spectrum and the open source license spectrum, and this is the key, the key, let's say, points to keep in mind is the level of permissiveness for certain types of open source licenses. So we go from strong copyleft over weak copyleft to permissive license, and just, I mean, there can be a whole presentation about open source licenses. I just want to give this basic overview here. So from left to right, the permissiveness becomes more free. So you get more freedom the farther you go to the right on this graph. Starting from strong copyleft licenses, what does it mean if you use software licensed under a strong copyleft license, like the classic one, the GPL? It means your own software has to be licensed under that license as well. So that's why it's called copyleft, and that's a pretty strong requirement, and that's something to consider when you license your or for the license you choose for your open source project. And yeah, we come to compatibilities later. But the thing to keep in mind here is that for strong copyleft licenses, usually if you use software that is licensed under a strong copyleft license, your software has to go under the same license as well, which can be problematic if you want to build a product based on that software and so on. Then there's weak copyleft license, which, as the name say, are a weaker copyleft. So in that case, for example, for the Eclipse public license, the point is if you use a project licensed under Eclipse public license, you can use it even in commercial product. The point is if you change something or modify something in the EPL license code, your contribution has to go back into the original open source project. So the idea of that is to kind of force you to contribute back to the open source project and not keep the innovation to the open source project for yourself, but contribute that back. But you can still use it to make money with it, for example. And then there's the permissive licenses, which I guess these days are the most used ones, Apache or MIT. And they basically allow you to do everything with the code. So you can just right away take it and sell it as a product, which is maybe not a good idea, but it's generally possible. So this distinguishment is what is important to keep in mind when looking into open source licenses. And then the next step, actually, so why I'm talking about all of this is that licenses come with license terms, right? And if you use a software license under a certain license, you have to comply to the terms of that license. And then it can become complicated if we think about compatibility between licenses. So coming back to the iceberg, our application is here on the top, and say we want to license it under Apache 2.0, for example. And all of this code below, all of these third-party projects or third-party libraries that we use are licensed under certain licenses. And usually, there's not a big issue if it's, again, Apache, MIT, EPL. It can be problematic if we're coming to the strong copyleft licenses, where we may run into compatibility issues. It becomes for sure problematic if we use code that is not that has not any license. There's no open source license associated to it. And then there are some licenses which are not open source license at all, because, for example, the JSON license, it claims to be an open source license, but has a term in it: the software shall be used for good and not for evil. And that's not an OZ approved license, because you cannot restrict the usage of an open source software. So you can, remember the 4 freedoms, right? You can use open source software even for evil. I mean, you can use it in your military products if you want. That's open source. And then there's also, some crazy licenses which you probably will not run into so often, like the beerware license, which says you should pay me a beer if you use my software and we meet occasionally. So that's it. The thing here is compatibility and compliance, and that's an issue that's becoming more and more important, especially for companies who are doing open source and who are using open source in their commercial products. So that's also something that open source foundations help with and provide some guidance, and luckily there's also some tool support to do this. So that becomes important when you start doing professional open source. And then there is, I don't think I have to talk too much to you about this. You know about community building, right? You are doing this. NFDI, I think, is a great and successful community, and it's the same for open source. If you do open source professionally and want to do it successfully, you have to invest in community building. You have to grow a community. You have to find developers, adopters, interact with other companies or organizations, and yeah, do it with marketing initiatives, events. Well, you know it, community building. It's a pretty important topic, but I will not go further into detail on this, because all of this, what I just said, boils down to, can be put into this image, which we call the framework for professional collaboration, where we actually enable companies and organizations to collaborate in a vendor-neutral, open and transparent and meritocratic manner. So we have the different foundations or building blocks that I talked before on the lowest level, right? We have infrastructure like GitLab, GitHub. We have ecosystem and community building. We have governance and transparent but strict and clear processes. We have proper IP and license management, and supply chain security, which is a pretty recent topics, which again is also a topic for another presentation. And building on these foundations, you and even your competitors are able to collaborate on building some great software, some great open source platform, usually trying to solve problems that you and your competitors or collaborators have in common, to actually save money on solving, not having to solve the same problem each by your own, right? And then on top of this, you or your competitors are able to compete on products, services, maintenance, whatever. Here we're talking about business models based on open source software. So that's the model I'm kind of trying to sell with this these ideas, and that works pretty well. So to conclude, I have a few slides about the Eclipse Foundation itself. We are a European-based open source foundation, a member-driven non-for-profit organization. Our home is Brussels, so we're acting under European law and regulations and hosting the code of our open source projects in Europe, which is important for some kinds of organizations. And yes, we are still home to the Eclipse IDE, but we are not the Eclipse IDE, right? We still face this confusion once in a while. We still love the Eclipse IDE. It's where it all started. It's still an important project, but it's one project among 415 open source projects that we're currently hosting at the Eclipse Foundation. So, yeah, we have, as I said, we are member-driven, not-for-profit organization. So in total, we have more than 330 member organizations, of which around 170 are based in Europe. So over the last 4 years, we really tried to become the European open source foundation. Yeah, just to mention our strategic members, and actually most of our strategic members are actually coming from Europe. Then I thought a bit about Eclipse projects or initiatives that could be of interest for your community. I'm not sure if that is right or makes sense, but I just wanted to bring that up, and we can discuss this later. So there's the Eclipse Data Space Components project, because I thought maybe there is some relation or interaction between you and the IDSA, the International Data Space Association, because I think topic-wise it may make sense. And I read also in some NFDI project about Gaia X, so maybe it makes sense. If not, tell me, that's fine too. So that's an open source project, Eclipse project, which implements the IDS data space protocol. So, well, basically the open source development part of the IDSA, which is run at the Eclipse Foundation. And, you know, I talked a lot about collaborating with competitors and having community-driven open source. That's a pretty nice example of, because all these companies, organizations are collaborating together on this Eclipse project. There's a second one, which is kind of the open source part of Gaia-X, which is the Gaia-X Federation Services, now called Eclipse XFSC. Yeah, which may be interesting for you, may be relevant. I put the links on this slide, so feel free to have a look at this. So I would guess this relates to the Christine, what you mentioned about infrastructure, I guess, but I'm not sure. As I said, it's just as information. And pretty recent activity is a related working group about data spaces. So working group is kind of we could call a mini foundation inside the Eclipse Foundation of companies who want to push a certain topic. So a working group basically manages a collection of open source projects for certain topics. So we have working groups on IoT, edge, cloud development tools, automotive, and so on. And the recent one is about data spaces. I think there will be an announcement in the beginning of December. It's already on the website, some information, and the founding members pretty much relate to the one who are working on the data space connector project, but that may be interesting for you as well. And the last thing, yes, we also participate in research projects, EU funded, also national German ones. And what we do there is basically everything I talked about today. So we help consortia to do successful open source, to actually avoid, pushing code to GitHub at the end of the project, and then it stays there and nothing happens anymore. So we try to help with that in research projects. We have participated in research projects from various domains, from IoT to cloud, even data, and so on. I will not go into detail. You can check our website, and of course, always contact me if you are in need of a partner who's good at open source in your research project. We are always happy to participate and to help. And that's all from me. Thank you for your attention, and keep in mind, open source is a journey, it's not a destination. Thank you very much.